My name is Elizabeth Zimmermann, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Dentistry. And what's really unique about me is that I'm an engineer. So my PhD was very intensive in engineering, studying the deformation and fracture processes, looking at bone as a material. And in my post-doctoral research, I studied at medical institutes. And at the medical institutes, I was looking at diseases that have to do with bone or aging of bone, and how these biological changes to the structure impact its fracture resistance. And this was just a great opportunity because I wasn't just with engineers, I was also interacting with clinicians and other biologists. And this really gave me a completely different outlook and how important it is to have an understanding of their needs and how they can use their research in their clinical practice. So I'm working with clinicians in the Faculty of Dentistry, and our long-term goal is to design a biomimetic dental implant. And this is very important because the periodontum, where you have the natural tooth structures, has multiple different types of tissues that each have a specific function, and it's very sophisticated structure. And currently, when you replace that, extract the tooth or lose the tooth and replace it with an implant, you're getting rid of some of those very important structures. So some of the functions that you're losing are the natural damping mechanical function during mastication. So those loads with an implant go directly to the bone, but in the natural structures, they're damped by this nonlinear viscoelastic tissue. Another thing that's different is the structures don't adapt to mechanical forces. So for instance, orthodontic tooth movement, you're applying a force and the tissues are sensing that force and coordinating bone resorption and bone formation. And you don't have that same adaptation. And so, for instance, children, you can't place dental implants in children because the facial structures will grow and the implant will stay in the same place. And so the idea is that we could design a better implant that will hopefully incorporate some of these functions. So the approach I'm taking is to study the natural tissues. So looking at their structure-function relationships and specifically understanding how they've adapted to their biomechanical environment. So for instance, if we look at human teeth, you have different types of teeth that have different macroscale geometries. So for instance, incisors, they cut food, canines, they tear food, and molars grind food. And so these all have different root structures and potentially are different at the level of the periodontal ligament and their connections to the bone. We don't necessarily want to copy what's there, but we want to learn more about it and potentially use some of that knowledge to design a better implant. And so one thing that helps us understand the deformation and fracture mechanisms of materials is in situ devices, so mechanical testing devices that can go inside of an electron microscope or inside of a light microscope. And these allow you to observe the deformation and fracture behavior while you're doing the mechanical test. So one instrument that we use often is microcomputed tomography. And this is very important because we have a very complex geometries. So you can imagine the complex shapes of the tooth. We have different tissues, and so there we can see spatially how these tissues are related. With this, we can also do higher resolution scans and look at spatial patterns in the pores, which is where the cells sit, and look at connections and patterns in these pore spaces. So the macroscale geometry will be the millimeter scale, and then some of the tissues will be closer to tens of microns, and the pores will also be quite small, pushing the resolution of the micro CT. My expertise is really with structure-function relationships in these biological materials and understanding deformation and fracture. So I'm very interested in collaborating with others in that field. I'm interested in making connections with clinicians who are interested in these complex biological tissues and how that can relate to their clinical practice. And I'm also interested in biomedical engineers or biologists who are looking at the interface between cells or tissues and artificial materials.